Our next speaker is Kerry McDonald. She's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. She's the host of the Liberated Podcast. She is the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. She is an education policy fellow at the State Policy Network. She is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and a regular Forbes contributor. Her interests include homeschooling and schooling alternatives, self-directed learning, education, entrepreneurship, parent empowerment, school choice, and family and child policy. Kerry's articles have appeared in various publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Reason Magazine, the Washington Examiner, City Journal, Entrepreneur, and the Journal of School Choice. She has a master's degree in education policy from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree in economics from Bowdoin College. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Kerry McDonald.
Thank you, Bill. It's so great to be here today at Liberty Forum. It's my first time at Liberty Forum. My family and I go to Pork Fest every year and always have a great time there, but nice to be with the Free State Project for your winter conference. And I'm thrilled today to talk about education, entrepreneurship, and permissionless innovation in education. I think it's such an exciting time in education. I've been in the education world and education policy for over 2 decades now, and I've never had so much fun or been so optimistic about the future of American education that I am today. And it's interesting, I checked into the hotel last night, came up a day early ahead of the storm, and the woman behind the counter who was checking me in, named Sally, said, "Oh, you're talking here tomorrow." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "What are you speaking about?" And I said, "Oh, education innovation." And she said, "Oh, homeschooling?" And I said, "Yes, homeschooling, microschooling, education entrepreneurship, all of the exciting learning models that are emerging." And she said, "Oh, that's so great. Get those kids out of the government indoctrination centers." I said, "This is why I love New Hampshire." So thrilled to be here. And that's really what I'll be talking over the next, say, 45 minutes about, and hoping to open it up for questions and answers as part of that too, is really this path towards education, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And the exodus that we're seeing in many places from government schools, from assigned district schools, for other options that are being created by entrepreneurial parents and educators who are solving a solution either for their family or for those in their community, and it's spreading like wildfire. So as I think back on the last few years of authoritarianism and overt government control in our lives, that was certainly true for me. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, much more authoritarianism there, and government overreach than certainly you saw here in the Free State, but it was everywhere. And there's a lot that we can and should be angry about, upset about, worried about regarding COVID policy and again, the kind of state intrusion into our lives. And yet I am incredibly optimistic by what I've seen come from that in the world of education. And that is this bottom-up momentum driven by entrepreneurial parents and educators to create something new and different. And that would be homeschooling in its various iterations. We saw the skyrocketing growth of homeschooling over the past several years that remains at pre-pandemic highs. And we've seen the growth of microschools, which is sort of an umbrella term that can include homeschooling and homeschool co-ops and collaboratives, but also can include low-cost private schools and other kinds of private education models. We've seen learning pods and pandemic pods, hybrid schools, all kinds of things develop. And it's such an exciting time, I think. I've been traveling the country, meeting with these microschool founders, having them on my podcast. So I started my podcast last February, once a week, interviewing these microschool founders and education entrepreneurs and homeschooling families. And it's been, there's so many to spotlight that I last fall increased the podcast to twice a week. And I could probably go to 3 times a week because there's so many founders, so many incredible people doing this work. And it gives me a lot of hope. You know, when I think about these founders that I meet and that I talk to, they're incredibly diverse. philosophically, ideologically, in terms of their educational models that they're building and the kind of educational approaches that they take. And yet they really are embracing sort of these libertarian values, individual freedom, not only for them as entrepreneurs, but importantly for the students in their programs, really focusing on individualized learning. They have a healthy skepticism toward government, especially when it comes to their work as education entrepreneurs. And they believe in free markets, whether they would say that or not. They definitely have this sense that kind of bottom-up, decentralized education solutions that are undergirded by free market principles are a key aspect of their success. And so that gives me hope that, again, even these very diverse founders are embracing classical liberal values. And they're also, because of that, really tolerant of each other. And so I have hope that this is sort of a movement that will trickle into other parts of our lives where we're able to see those classical liberal values of tolerance for difference and diversity and kind of live and let live begin to shine through. So when I talk about what's happened over the past few years, I love this quote. I'm sure you've seen it in the context of the aftermath of COVID policy, and I'll talk about it in terms of education. This is, of course, Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, who in Capitalism and Freedom, his book, he wrote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." The ideas that are lying around. And in education, those ideas were all of these things: homeschooling, microschooling, education entrepreneurship, permissionless innovation, school choice, schooling alternatives. All of these things, all of these ideas were lying around pre-2020. We saw the growth and diversification of the homeschooling movement becoming much more reflective of the American population as a whole before 2020. We saw the growth of microschools. We saw the kind of the consolidation of the two, homeschooling and microschooling. I know tomorrow you'll hear from Kitty Michelotti, who is going to also be talking about permissionless education. She and Sharon Osborne back in 2019, as homeschooling parents, decided to create what really is a microschool, a homeschool resource center that allows students to come in and take classes several times a week. They actually won the Yaz Prize. They were semifinalists in the Yaz Prize, which is a prestigious kind of philanthropic award. They won $100,000 for their work with that microschool. So these were ideas that were lying around that are now taking off in the wake of education disruption. And, you know, along with kind of individual microschools like Kitty's, Latitude Learning in Derry, there were also many microschool networks that were gaining traction and momentum pre-2020, dating back really we'll go back to Acton Academy back in 2010. Some of you may be familiar with Acton Academy, a fast-growing microschool network. There's Acton Academy Seacoast here in New Hampshire. This was started by Jeff and Laura Sandifer in Austin, Texas in 2010. Now, Acton Academy has more than 280 microschools across the country in more than 30 states and around the world. And some of them are operating as homeschool resource centers, often because of legality or regulations in their state, sort of can influence whether they open as a recognized private school or a homeschool collaborative. But they're really focused on learner-driven education. It's not at all top-down. It's all directed by the individual child and supported by guides in the program. And so that's an exciting microschool network that was definitely gaining traction and popularity pre-2020 and has just taken off, one of those ideas lying around. You also had Liberated Learners. That was a network of self-directed learning centers that I wrote about in my Unschooled book. This was started as a network back in 2013, but the initial kind of model for Liberated Learners as self-directed learning centers for homeschoolers was created by Ken Danford, who created North Star, Self-Directed Learning for Teens, a learning center or microschool in Western Massachusetts in 1996. Ken was a longtime public school teacher, middle school social studies teacher who became disillusioned by what he was seeing in the classroom and decided to leave and create a schooling alternative that was North Star, and then created this network of North Star-like microschools across the country back in 2013. 2014, Wildflower Schools, Microschools, was created in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 2014, is now a network of Montessori-inspired kind of storefront microschools across the country. There's more than 60 across the country. They also recently started to open a few charter schools that are doing quite well. One I just visited in New York City. And when we talk about microschools, it means different things to different people. They're kind of, it's an umbrella term that a lot of people kind of self-identify as a microschool. But a few kind of common characteristics: it tends to be led by hired or paid educators, intentionally small learning communities, mixed ages, so it has that kind of one-room schoolhouse feel, and low cost. A lot of these microschools are a fraction of the cost of traditional private schools, a quarter or a fifth the cost of a traditional private school. So already more accessible financially to more families just by nature. And then finally, I'm sure many of you have heard about Prenda Learning Pods. They also exist here in New Hampshire. I know Commissioner Edelblue used some of the federal COVID relief funds to try to expand Prenda Pods across the state and make them tuition free for families, kind of an innovative way of using those COVID dollars. But Prenda was started as a learning pod with a handful of kids in Arizona in 2018. The founder, Kelly Smith, wanted to create something for his child and some other children in his community, so he created this learning pod. And now Prenda has reached over 10,000 students across the country and continues to grow through its public-private partnerships as well as private models. So these were some of the ideas that were lying around, and these were also the ideas that I talked about in my 2019 book, Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. It came out in the spring of 2019, but had a boost in sales in the spring of 2020 and beyond, because those were the ideas lying around. I talked about microschools in this book. I talked about individualized learning, self-directed education, and of course, again, the growth and diversification of homeschooling, that kind of parent empowerment piece. So if we think about kind of stepping back to see what has happened in education over the past 3 years of education disruption, and with that disruption has come all of this opportunity, these ideas lying around that are now taking off at record rates. We look at kind of the 3 E's of education transformation that I think are really defined by the last 3 years, beginning with parent empowerment. So this was happening a little bit before the pandemic. It took off since then. And back in the spring of 2020, I remember in March of 2020, I wrote an article in my Forbes column saying this was the world's homeschooling movement or moment. This was the time when everyone would at least start to see that there were other ways to approach education beyond an assigned district school. And I just remember even thinking at that time that if this lasts a few weeks, it's going to be a game changer. And of course, it lasted a few years. And that's where I think we've seen just disruption that will mean that we're not ever going back to the way it was, which is a good thing when it comes to education. The summer of 2020, we saw the term pandemic pod pop up. And these were really just sort of homeschool co-ops, basically. We would call them homeschool co-ops, but they were parents saying, look, we don't know if school's going to reopen. Our kids have been disconnected from their social communities, their friends for months. We have to take matters into our own hands. And so we started to see these spontaneous groups of parents getting together to create these co-learning communities in their homes, sometimes facilitated by parents, sometimes with paid facilitators and educators. And, you know, I wrote along those same lines that at that time, parents were done waiting for permission. They said, you know, we're not going to wait around to see what the school district's going to do. We're not going to see if we even have permission to run these pods or these microschools out of our homes. We're just going to do it. And that's where that permissionless piece, I think, is so critical. Some of you may know the term permissionless innovation. It was coined by Adam Thierer in his book. He talked about it in the context of Uber and Lyft kind of going into a market without permission, saturating the market with ride-sharing apps that then catch on. And by the time regulators caught on to what was happening, it was too late. It was already too embedded and had really changed the transportation industry. So we saw a lot of parent empowerment in 2020, and that led to exit. So this kind of mass exodus from district schools throughout 2020 and 2021, the Census Bureau finding a doubling of the homeschool rate in 2020, tripling from pre-pandemic levels to more than 11% of the overall U.S. K-12 school-age population being homeschooled. And the biggest driver of that growth came from Black homeschooling families that saw a 5-fold increase in the number of homeschoolers. In fact, the Black homeschoolers became overrepresented in the homeschool population than their representation in the overall K-12 school-age population, public school. So massive growth and diversification there, and we still see record rates now of homeschooling, far above the pre-pandemic levels. We saw the growth of these alternatives as families were embracing other ways of teaching and learning. And then we saw district schools across the country lose students, particularly those that remained shuttered for a longer period of time. But what's really fascinating is there's new data out showing that these students aren't going back. The Wall Street Journal in January found over a million students have left district schools. They're not going back. They're going to private schools, home schools, charter schools, parochial schools, but they're leaving district schools. And also in January, the PBS affiliate in Chicago found that since 2019, the Chicago public schools have lost 10% of their overall student body, about 37,000 students. And more than 90% of those students that have left are low-income minority children. So the idea that, it's only sort of affluent families that can exercise choice, particularly in a state like Illinois that doesn't have, school choice policies, is just wrong. Families want choice. They want options, and they were empowered to begin to see what those options would be thanks to the education disruption caused by COVID. So a real bright spot in what otherwise was a really dark time. So what did these exits from government schools end up looking like? What were some of the entrepreneurs doing? How did they emerge? And I thought I'd share some examples of some of the Microschool founders and education entrepreneurs that I've been able to visit with and interview over the past couple of years to give you a sense of some of the models they're creating and why they created them. So we'll start with Jill Perez. Jill was a longtime public school teacher in New Jersey. She had more recently left to do student teaching, to work as a student teacher supervisor at the college level for Rutgers and Seton Hall. And then when COVID hit, she created a pandemic pod, like so many families across the country, and kind of took turns with some other friends facilitating a curriculum in 2020 to 2021. So many families in her area loved what she was doing, kind of heard about what she was doing, that they urged her to create something more formal, more established. So in the fall of 2021, Jill opened Tranquil Teachings Learning Center in New Jersey, a microschool with about 50 students, mixed age, intentionally small. Families could either attend part-time or full-time as homeschoolers or as a kind of full-time schooling alternative in New Jersey. She was able to recruit public school teachers from the New York City public schools to her program who were burnt out from remote learning and unwilling to comply with various COVID policies. So she was able to recruit them to her program. She continues to grow and to flourish. She ended up purchasing a building for her microschool, and it continues today. So that's just one example of how these pods ended up evolving in many cases into full-fledged microschools. That then leads to more and more options for families. So it's really the snowball effect of parents being more empowered, wanting to exit an assigned district school, and now entrepreneurs recognizing that demand for alternatives and creating them, which is really, really exciting. Another example, this is Felicia Rattray. She's a Microschool founder in Fort Lauderdale, another longtime public school teacher. She taught in both public schools and charter schools in Florida. And I will say that not only in my unschooled book, but also in the entrepreneurs that I've interviewed on my podcast over the past year and in articles, the vast majority are former public school teachers who really do become disillusioned with what they're seeing in the system. Maybe they see how the sausage gets made and then decide to exit to create something better. So Felicia, and this is her husband, Amnon, she was teaching in the charter schools. She had recently gained custody of her nephew during COVID and discovered through his Zoom school, that he was way behind academically. So he was in the 3rd grade, but was performing at a kindergarten level. And she said, this is unacceptable. I got to take the matters into my own hands and do something. So she ended up incubating her microschool in another microschool in Fort Lauderdale that was created before 2020, back in 2019, Compass Education Center. So she incubated there and then went off to create her own microschool, which now has 20 students, 4 teachers, mixed age. And she says that if it weren't for the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship Program, the robust school choice policy that exists in Florida, only about 2 of her 20 students would be able to attend because she serves an almost entirely low-income community of students. So that's an example where school choice policies can really make a difference in expanding access to these programs that are already quite affordable, but still out of reach for many families. All right, let's go to New York City. I was just in New York City a couple of weeks ago visiting with the Microschool founders there and some innovative educators in the city there. And this is Dr. Lisa Scott. She was a longtime education professor at CUNY Queens and Hunter College in New York. She said that she was really starting over the past several years to get tired of what she was seeing in education. She was working mostly with graduate students who would be going off into public schools. She said, I started to feel more like a salesperson than an educator. And in 2020, it was that nudge caused by school shutdowns and COVID policy that led her to create her microschool in the Dumbo area of Brooklyn, down underneath the Manhattan Bridge overpass. And so now she has a couple of teachers, a bunch of students, mostly elementary school age, doing some really wonderful things for students there. And she wants to continue to expand. You'll see interesting themes with these Microschool founders, these entrepreneurs. They don't want to scale vertically. They don't want to become big private schools. They want to grow, but they want to do that horizontally by opening up additional small schools. It's really exciting. Another longtime teacher, this is Donna Akers. She lives in a rural community of Mississippi, Pontotoc, Mississippi. She was planning to retire from a career almost 30 years as a public school teacher in her community in Mississippi. And then when COVID hit, she said, I think now's the time for me to be an entrepreneur instead. So she ended up connecting with the Acton Academy Network that I mentioned earlier, becoming an Acton Academy affiliate, which everyone is sort of individually owned and operated. And now she has about 50 students in her microschool in, again, this rural community. So that's one thing that, we hear sometimes from critics of kind of education entrepreneurship or school choice, that it's not... it doesn't reach rural communities. And I think this just shows that it does, that it's up to those entrepreneurial educators and inspiring them and helping them. And she's able to do that. She's also a huge advocate for school choice policies. Mississippi does not have many. Also in Mississippi, this is Taquita Funchess and Stephanie Harper. They are or were longtime Jackson, Mississippi public school teachers. And they also decided to create a microschool. This one they opened in August, mainly for their own children. So they found that their kids were in actually other private schools, but had some learning needs, some dyslexia, some various learning challenges. They were also, their 2 daughters were also quite anxious. Takita, who's on my left here, or on the left of your screen, she was a math teacher in the Jackson Public Schools. She has a graduate degree in computer science, and she was just feeling like there was nothing that was working for her daughter in particular, who had been diagnosed with ADHD and anxiety and was on medication for both ADHD and anxiety for years, and nothing was really working. And then they opened this microschool just outside of Jackson in August, and Takita said that by October, her daughter was completely off all of her ADHD and anxiety medications and no longer needed to see a counselor for anxiety. And all that had changed was the learning environment, moving from more of a traditional private school environment into this very personalized microschool space. So they're doing some great things, also hoping to expand horizontally. A couple more examples. This is Pam McEwen, who had been running, she was also a public school teacher in Wichita, Kansas. She had been more recently running a tutoring program after school for students, but then when COVID hit, her family said, gee, we have remote learning. We really want our kids to be learning together and doing some, enrichment activities and continuing to gain academic proficiency. Would you take our kids during the day? And then that evolved into her microschool called the Izora Elaine Dean Educational Center, named after her grandmother. And it's now a full-fledged microschool. She still does the tutoring after school, but she has about 50 kids during the day. Finally, this is Chris Turner. He was a software entrepreneur, had sold a previous startup, and was really looking at solving an issue for his son. He couldn't find any schools in his area of Decatur, Georgia that appealed to him. Tried a charter school, but couldn't get off the wait list for that charter school, so realized he had to do something on his own. So he ended up creating Moonrise, which is a co-learning community in Decatur. It's kind of like a WeWork for kids. So it's sort of a drop-in, drop-out. You could go full-time, part-time, all self-directed with adult facilitators there to guide, but not to influence. And he's also expanding nationally. But he has encountered some issues around regulations where, Georgia regulators wanted him to be a licensed child care center. He said, I don't deal with young children. I deal with K-12 children. Why would I be licensed as a daycare center? Because regulators often don't know what to make of these innovative education models, and yet the entrepreneurs are just pushing through with that permissionless innovation. They say, we're gonna open, we're gonna exist, and then we'll see if regulations can catch up. But he'll tell you, and he said this on my podcast, he said, I don't see us ever going into some states where these regulations are too high. Like he said, New York, he can't imagine going in there, but Arizona, which is where he's planning to go next, is kind of wide open for education entrepreneurship. So in talking to all of these different founders and entrepreneurs across the country, I've come up with sort of 5 key characteristics that I think are similar among them. So they're incredibly diverse, both pedagogically, educationally. They have very different models, and diverse in terms of their founder worldviews and perspectives. And yet they are, happy for each other to exist. And I think that that's one thing that's really exciting to see from this. Some of you might recall, and I talk about this in my Unschooled book, the free school movement back in the 1960s was a kind of a predecessor to today's microschool movement of little small schools that started to grow across the country. There ended up being hundreds of them as part of the countercultural left in the late 60s, early 1970s, which was also when the modern homeschooling movement began at the same time, again, driven by the countercultural left. But what happened with the free schools is because they were so ideologically homogeneous, kind of embracing kind of a more radical pedagogy that was very progressive, that once that kind of countercultural ethos faded, the schools faded too. I think that won't happen now because of the diversity of these models. We have, very progressive education, very progressive education models and microschools, homeschool collaboratives, and very conservative homeschool collaboratives and microschools. And it's that diversity that I think is going to be their ultimate strength. They're also incredibly decentralized, so they really are these kind of bottom-up models. They want to retain that kind of decentralization. They don't want the government involved. They want to do their own thing. They focus really on individualized curriculum, personalized learning. They don't want that kind of top-down standardized system. That's what they're rejecting, and they're building something that's much more learner-centered. There's a tremendous amount of collaboration among these founders. Again, they could be very diverse, very different worldviews, and then they say, I'm glad that you exist. I was just in Las Vegas, for example. 25 microschools within a 10-mile radius of the Las Vegas Strip, serving over 300 students. That's expected to more than double to over 600 students in the next 18 months. Very, very diverse. I had talked to, very Christian conservative microschool founders running kind of a church-based microschool who's happy to stand next to the very, very progressive new microschool that just opened. And even though, again, very different worldviews, happy to have each other kind of in the same ecosystem and provide those options for families. And that gives me hope that these entrepreneurs are showing how we kind of heal divisions within our society, and that's by embracing classical liberal values of tolerance for difference and individual freedom and free markets. And then finally, accessibility is a key priority for these microschool founders. I mentioned Felicia Rattray, who makes her program accessible by participating in the Florida school choice programs. But even in states like Kansas or Mississippi, where there aren't, or New York, where there aren't robust school choice policies, founders are really doing whatever they can to make sure that anyone who wants to can attend their program. They do that with sliding scale tuitions. They do that with seeking out grants. And what we're seeing really is this philanthropic interest in microschools and education entrepreneurship. So I mentioned that Kitty Michelotti, who you'll hear about tomorrow, she won the $100,000 Yaz Prize semifinalist award. That is a program that's really trying to invest in these permissionless educators. There's also the Vela Education Fund that's funded by Stand Together Trust and the Walton Family Foundation, that has given out more than 2,000 microgrants over the past 3 years to microschool founders and education entrepreneurs, totaling over $20 million. And they just opened a new $30 million fund last week to continue that process. So huge philanthropic interest in these decentralized microschools and entrepreneurship. But as I was talking with a lot of these founders, I discovered that they were encountering some real regulatory challenges. And I mentioned Chris Turner, who's running that co-learning community, Moonrise in Georgia, who is finding that he's not going to go into certain states because of their regulations. And so as I started kind of digging through, hearing these stories from founders, I said, wow, there's a lot of barriers to these entrepreneurs. And of course, I'm sure there's entrepreneurs in this room. Entrepreneurship is hard. You often encounter regulatory barriers. We as libertarians try to pull down some of those barriers the best we can or draw attention to them. It's even worse in some cases for education entrepreneurs because they're going up against a monopolistic system in a highly, highly regulated sector. So I started to bring attention to those stories. And this is James Lomax. He was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He had a successful career as a Navy officer. He worked as an engineer, aeronautic engineer, unable to start an Acton Academy private school in Nevada because Nevada has some of the strictest private school regulations in the country. You have to be a licensed state of Nevada teacher or administrator if you're going to open a private school in Nevada or a secular private school. It's not if you're a religious private school. And so he said he wasn't able to open there. So he ended up creating his Acton Academy as a homeschool collaborative. Again, that kind of permissionless innovation, but it also prevents him from doing some of the things that he wants to do, that he'd be able to do as a private school. For example, getting access to that opportunity scholarship program, the tax credit scholarship program in Nevada that allows more families to attend a program like that. So that's one example. Right here in New Hampshire, this is Becky Owens in Chester, New Hampshire. She started running just sort of a homeschool co-op. She was offering nature hikes on her farm in Chester back in 2020. and had a sign out in front that said, farm hike today. She had gotten a handful of homeschool students to come to her program, and she was going to lead these hikes in her property. And the local building inspector sent her a cease and desist order for operating an illegal business on her property. So she ended up having to go jump through a bunch of hoops, go to zoning meetings and local building code meetings. She had to spend money on getting an aerial drone view of her property so she could prove that she was worthy. Eventually she was allowed to basically run these hikes outside on her property, but was told that she could never hire staff. She could never expand to be an inside program. There were all of these barriers that were put in her way, and all she was trying to do was meet the needs of her community. I should also say that she has a PhD in education, taught at the university level for 15 years, had been homeschooling her own kids, and just wanted to meet a need in her community and was blocked by regulations. So what I did was start to take these stories of these entrepreneurs and try to put them into some kinds of recommendations. I wrote a policy paper for State Policy Network that came out last fall, that looked at some of these barriers, as well as some recommendations for state-level policymakers that could make it easier for these education entrepreneurs through a deregulatory strategy. So that would be, again, dealing with the childcare licensing morass. It could be making it easier to start a private school. It could be reducing compulsory attendance laws, and so on. And this brings us to kind of, as I begin to wrap up the conversation and open it up in a few minutes to your questions and your thoughts. When we think about the ease of education transformation, obviously it's been parent empowerment, exit from assigned district schools, entrepreneurship, and the incredible models that these entrepreneurs are building. And we've also seen a dramatic expansion of school choice policies. And I know we'll have a more robust discussion with Jody this afternoon at 2:00 on a panel about school choice. But it's really been fascinating to see what's happened over the past couple of years. 2021 was considered the year of school choice. 19 states introduced or expanded school choice policies that enabled funding to follow students. That was followed in 2022 by the first universal ESA program, Education Savings Account program, in Arizona. And now 2023, out of the gate, we have Iowa and Utah just passing ESAs. Looks like Arkansas is next. So the momentum continues for school choice policies. And I think it's worth showing the rest of this Milton Friedman quote, because this is where I think school choice policies fit in. He says, only in a crisis, actual or perceived produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas lying around. Of course, we just talked about that. But then he says, that I believe is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And I think that's what we're seeing for sure with these school choice policies. Now, I think a lot of us as libertarians have reservations about school choice policies. And Milton Friedman had those same reservations, right? He said, we regard the voucher plan. He was sort of the founding father of vouchers in a 1955 article, and then pushing for school choice policies that would enable funding to follow families. But he had those same reservations. He says, we regard the voucher plan as a partial solution because it affects neither the financing of schooling nor the compulsory attendance laws. We favor going much further. He and his wife, economist wife Rose, wrote that in Free to Choose. So it is a partial measure, right? I mean, we're not dealing with eliminating compulsory schooling laws, which should be our primary goal in really getting the government out of education and creating a fully privatized free market of education. And again, that would also help to move us away from compulsory taxation of education. But what these school choice policies do is redistribute that $800 billion a year that U.S. taxpayers are currently spending on K-12 public schooling, and give that back to families to choose as they will. So it's a partial measure, but it's a step in the right direction. Of course, the ultimate goal is a fully free market in education. without any kind of government involvement. And this was the vision of Leonard Read, who founded FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, where I work. He wrote this in 1964 in his essay, The Case for the Free Market in Education. He said, creative thought on education would manifest itself in millions of individuals. Such genius as we potentially and compositely possess would assert itself and take the place of deadening restraints. Any person who understands the free market knows without any qualification whatsoever that there would be more education and better education. And a person with a faith in free men is confident that the cost per unit of learning accomplished would be far, far less. And I think we're seeing that manifestation of creative thought and education with these education entrepreneurs. So we're moving in the right direction as... Well, I just had one slide left. I don't know what happened, but as one of my Microschool founders in Wichita, Kansas said, the fringe is becoming the cloth. I think we're seeing that in homeschooling. We're seeing that in microschooling. I think that the future is bright for all of this, and the momentum will continue. And so I'd love to open it up for your thoughts and conversation, and hope you'll also join Jody and me and the rest of the panel at 2 o'clock to talk more about the intersection between school choice policy and education. Thanks. So I think we have about 5 minutes if you have any questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Kerry.
Oh, 10 minutes, Miranda? Okay, great.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation and for all of your optimism. I'm from Connecticut, which has been a horrible state to live in for the last few years. And clearly we've had so many people pull their kids out of school. Luckily in Connecticut, we have an amazing homeschool community. My kids are grown, so I'm just speaking from my experience of talking to a lot of homeschool people. But in Connecticut, we have been made very aware in our freedom community of PSAs and PMAs
Yeah.
and PMEs for education.
Yes.
So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of those, because you were speaking of the man in, I can't remember.
Nevada.
Okay. The man who, with the picture with his son.
Oh, Chris Turner, yeah. Sorry,
Okay.
Georgia, yeah.
And it sounded like he was coming up against a lot of regulations. So that could be a way that he could move forward in many states where he's feeling very restricted.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. So several of the Microschool founders I talked to, including the first one I had up there, Jill Perez in New Jersey, run as PMAs, private membership associations. Several of the founders in New York City also do the same thing. I think that's a really good point about Chris. The James was the one I thought you were talking about, James Lomax in Nevada, who wanted to create a private school but couldn't. He is running not so much as a PMA, but under kind of homeschool regulations, which are relatively light in Nevada as they are in Connecticut, which is why I think, you have some success there. But he really actually wanted to access the school choice policies, and in order to do that, you had to be a recognized private school. So there are those trade-offs, but these PMAs are doing some amazing things, and again, kind of fits into that permissionless innovation ecosystem that we're in. Yeah, thanks. Hi.
Hi, my name is Larry Borland. I'm from Wolfboro and previously from southwestern Pennsylvania, where I was 8 years as a school board president in a public school system. I'm completely for all of these issues, but I'm, as a person strategically, like to look at strategy. I'd like to identifying the clients, which are the students and or the parents that would be interested in this. I'm not sure that your bulk data is, I think, missing segregating things. I'm actually on the board, a disclaimer, on the board of directors of a new corporation called EduTech, and it's looking at the missing students, which has profoundly increased and actually is a defined group anymore. And they're not in homeschooling or microschools. And I wonder if you have any comment about that, because when you say 10% have left the public school systems, we all go, yay! But if they're gone, and the data from cities like Cleveland and Philadelphia is public data, where they have just disappeared, I did contact and ask the same question to the Secretary of Education here in New Hampshire, and I believe I can quote him: "We don't have a single student in New Hampshire who went missing." I said, "I don't believe you." Okay.
Yeah, I would say, they're not missing. Their parents know exactly where they are.
But
So, that is the headline, right? Oh, missing students. Most of those missing, quote unquote, missing students are students who didn't register for kindergarten. So they're still under the compulsory schooling age in a lot of states. They're not missing. The parents are just delaying schooling. Maybe they're homeschooling. Maybe they're forming a pod. Maybe that pod's going to increase into a microschool. Maybe they're going to connect with local homeschooling families and realize that that's the future for them. So that data, I think, is a little bit skewed. Again, most of them coming from students who just haven't registered for kindergarten and would be expected to. But that's, to me, a good sign that parents are re-empowered and exiting the system. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to me that pretty much the most progressive group of people in any town is the school board, hands down. They'll call you, a terrorist if you want to critique anything that they're saying. Do you have advice for parents to get involved with school boards who might think that they're not qualified or that they don't have a voice or that they won't listen to them?
So I think there's two general strategies, and this, Miranda, if depending on how we're doing on time, might be okay. We have a couple minutes. There are two general strategies with education, I think. There's voice and exit. So we can spend our time battling at school boards and trying to gain political control at the school board level so that we can inject our will or inflict our will upon others the same way they may be inflicting their will upon us in government systems. Or we can exit. And I think that I certainly find so much more promise and so much more hope in the exit strategy of empowering families to leave an assigned district school, whether that's just by their own means or through school choice policies that make that possible. Or if it's also encouraging entrepreneurs to create these new solutions so families have more choices that they can access, which is even more important now with school choice policies. We can pass all these ESAs. You have EFAs, education freedom accounts here in New Hampshire. There's still not enough supply to meet all that demand or all of the students who are eligible. So activating that supply. And I think this gets back to the point that I made a little bit earlier in the beginning of the conversation, which is why I think there's so much potential for education entrepreneurship as kind of a driver for societal change and kind of taking the temperature down among all of our divisions is because we don't need to battle anymore. We can find the microschool, the low-cost private school, the learning pod, the homeschool collaborative, the hybrid school, the virtual school that works just right for our family, for our individual children. We don't have to battle in school boards to, again, impose our will upon others. And I think, again, as libertarians, we should really be focused on that. We want to make sure that we're encouraging kind of these free market principles and providing opportunities to exit government institutions.
If an individual or a charitable organization wanted to make a donation of some kind to support the movement, where would you recommend, depending on what state you're in?
Oh, what a good question. Well, I mean, you could start with looking at what's in your local communities, looking at some of the microschools. They're always doing more with less. They're cutting costs. They're trying to create scholarships and tuition-free options for families. So look at the kind of local charity, finding those microschools and providing a donation to them. That would be number one. You can also look into some of the larger scale philanthropic efforts. Like I mentioned, the Vela Education Fund that is providing these microgrants on a much larger scale to more entrepreneurs across the country. So my tendency would be, or my preference would be maybe act locally and find those programs that fit your values and that you want to see succeed, maybe provide more access to those. But you can also look at some of these national ones too. Anything else? Great. Well, thank you so much. It was great being here. Look forward to our 2 o'clock.
Feel free to make your way over for lunch. We got an hour break. There's lunch out there. If you didn't sign up for lunch, there's the Backyard Brewery across the way, or you're welcome to go anywhere else. But we've got an hour break, and then we'll have our next talker here, I believe, is our next speaker is Joel Valenzuela, I think. So we'll be back at 1 p.m.